Well, thank you everyone, and thank you Helen for chairing this event. Really grateful for you joining us, and thank you to everybody for turning up. We have had over 170 people register, so a big welcome to you all. I just want to check whether you can see my slides are up on the screen there. Great. Okay, so my talk today is going to be about social mobility, segregation, and the integration of migrants. And that word, integration, is of course a controversial term. It means different things to different people. For some people, integration is really a euphemism for assimilation, the stripping away of the distinctive culture, religion, values that migrants have in order to make them more like us. And it's only by becoming more like us that we allow them to join us, to be part of us. Of course, there are problems with that approach to integration. For one thing, I think it reveals our own intolerance, our own prejudice. You know, we're saying they can only be integrated if they take on our properties, our attributes, when in actual fact we might be greatly enriched rather than diminished by the diversity that they would bring. I think also that view of integration assumes a false perception of the host country as being in some way homogenous or itself integrated, when the reality, of course, is that Britain isn't integrated and it isn't homogenous. It's stratified, it's unequal, it's divided, and it's also very heterogeneous. Britain has always been a country of immigrants. There's no clear indigenous group apart from the Welsh, of course, but even the Welsh came from Spain and from Portugal. We've never had our own dominant indigenous group. And what's more, we've become less homogenous. We've become European, essentially. If we turn the clock back to 1971 and we look at what the map of immigration looked like back then, in terms of the percentage of people who were non-UK born but born in Europe, so I'll just simply call them European born, and we'll see that the map of Britain is red. Essentially, nearly all of the UK is red, and by red in this map, it means that less than 1% of that ward's makeup is European born. So the vast majority of Britain back in 1971 had very few people that were born outside of the UK and in Europe. Fast forward to 2011 and we see that most of the UK became orange and yellow. In other words, vast majority of Britain now has more than 1%, between 1 and 5% European born people. But what's really interesting is that there are certain parts of the UK where actually most people in the UK live, or a disproportionate amount, and that's in London and the southeast. We see that those areas have turned blue, and blue on this map means between 10 and 32% of people in those wards were actually born in Europe. So Britain is a very diverse place. It's a place of great heterogeneity, and it's also a divided country, as I'll discuss in a few moments. For others, of course, integration is really about residential mix. It's about an anxiety about segregation, sleepwalking into segregation, the formation of ghettos, the idea that if we allow migrants to come, they will form their own communities, they will essentially be cut off from the rest of society. The problem with this approach, to a segregation, residential segregation approach to defining integration, is that it says more about the willingness of the majority group to facilitate residential mixing. In fact, the most segregated group in Britain are the white British. Why is that? Well, it's partly to do with affluence and concentration in areas with the most expensive housing. It may also be due to white flight. As migrants and ethnic minorities move into a neighbourhood, the tendency for white British to move out makes it impossible for there to be residential mix. And also there's the issue of racial harassment. Some very troubling findings by the work of Alita Nandi has shown extraordinarily worrying levels of anxiety and incidents of racial harassment that's experienced by many ethnic minority groups and migrant groups. And it's not surprising then, if you're in an ethnic group or a migrant group that was experiencing racial harassment, it's understandable that you'd want to live in an area that had a high proportion of your own group. It may be that that's not your first preference. You may well want to be in other more mixed communities, including white British, but if your experience is very negative, that might have impacts on your mental health. And there's a whole branch of literature that reinforces that. The ethnic density literature shows conclusively that there are mental health benefits to certain minority groups by living in areas with a high proportion of their own group. Understandable if they're experiencing racial harassment. But I think perhaps the most important driver is just simply housing affordability. When migrants come to this country, often they are taking jobs that are relatively low income, at least when they first arrive. That means that they're very limited in the choices of places where they can live. They essentially have to live in low price areas. And if we want those migrant groups to be residentially integrated, to be part of white British neighbourhoods, then they have to be able to progress up the housing ladder. And to progress up the housing ladder, they have to progress up the education ladder. They have to progress in the labour market. And they have to also have the equivalent levels of social care and health that we have. All those things that determine essentially social mobility. That's what they need to have if they're going to become residentially mixed. And that leads us to this broader definition of integration that's been proposed by the Home Office. And it says that successful integration entails migrants being able to achieve outcomes within employment, housing, education, health, etc., which are equivalent to those achieved within the wider host communities. I think there are real strengths with this approach, partly I think because it shifts the emphasis towards equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. And I think it helps to reframe the discussion in terms of social justice, social inclusion, and social mobility. And more than that, I think it allows us to think about integration as a broader thing that encompasses society as a whole. It's not about whether migrants are integrated, but it's about whether society as a whole is integrated. Why is that? Why is that so important? Well, we cannot ensure the integration of migrants in terms of social mobility without considering the integration of society as a whole in terms of social mobility. And that's because if you imagine if social mobility varies geographically, if there are some parts of the UK where there's really very limited opportunity to progress in life, there are high levels of deprivation. If migrants move into those kind of areas, then they will also face low social mobility. So unless society as a whole is integrated in that way in terms of social mobility, then we can't expect migrants to be integrated in terms of social mobility. So what we're moving towards here then is essentially a very dynamic approach to integration, because social mobility is a very dynamic concept. It's essentially the degree of movement, fluidity in society between different layers of the social hierarchy. And that social mobility is also profoundly spatial. Where we grow up, where we go to school, who we had contact with in our formative years, our exposure to crime, to violence, to pollution, particularly in our younger years, have a huge impact on our life chances, how much we can progress in life. And that variability of social mobility then across areas itself has major implications. There's a very strong spatial dimension to it. In contrast to that very dynamic, very spatial notion of integration through social mobility is the measures that are used currently to measure integration, which I think, to my knowledge, tend to be largely static and non-spatial. As an example, consider the Home Office indicators of integration, which I think has a lot to commend it. There's a huge amount of work that's gone into putting those indicators together. But I think their weakness in their current form, I think there's room for improvement, essentially. In their current form, they're essentially aggregate snapshots. They basically say, let's look at this migrant group on average. This is the percentage that, for example, are in employment. Compare that then to the percentage who are in employment in the country as a whole or amongst non-migrant groups. But the reality is that each one of those individuals, both in the migrant group and in the non-migrant group, each one of them is on a trajectory. And it's those trajectories, those life trajectories that we're interested in. Are they different? Are they steeper for non-migrants compared to migrants? And also, existing measures tend to be non-spatial. As far as I'm aware, in the Home Office indicators of integration, there's no measure of residential segregation. There's no measure of the spatial opportunity structures, as George Golster coins them, the nature, the connection that we have to opportunities that allow us to progress in education and employment. Without those, I think we're missing something really important. So we're essentially proposing a new research agenda in terms of integration of migrants. We're saying what we need to do is develop measures of integration that capture the spatial and dynamic drivers of integration, that focus on social mobility, and that take into account the variation across space in opportunities for social mobility. One of the things we're particularly interested in is the impact of segregation and these neighborhood level factors in determining social mobility. And one particular type of segregation, which we've called social frontiers. Social frontiers basically describe areas or boundaries between two communities where there is a very sharp spatial distinction between the two. Rather than a gradual blending at the boundary between those two very different communities, there is instead a kind of a cliff edge, if you like. And we see that most prominently and most famously perhaps in Belfast, where you have neighbourhoods that are almost entirely Catholic, right next door to neighbourhoods that are almost entirely Protestant. And rather there being a mixing, a blending of residential patterns at the boundary between those two areas, actually what we see is this social frontier or cliff edge, this very sharp tailing off of one group before the next group begins. And of course, in Belfast and other parts of Northern Ireland, these social frontiers are very visible because they're marked by peace walls, physical barriers that have been constructed to keep rival communities apart. But we think that in most instances, social frontiers don't have those physical manifestations. What they are essentially is invisible. And here's an example of some research that we did on Rotherham in a previous project with Dan Olner and others. And what we see here is the percentage of non-white British in Rotherham in 2011. what it clearly illustrates, I think, is that rather than there being a gradual transition from areas that have low proportion non-white to those that have a high proportion, instead you get this step change, you get this social frontier, this cliff edge in social space. And one of the things that we've been working on in those previous projects is coming up with statistical algorithms that robustly detect where these social frontiers lie. So we're trying to transfer or identify where these cliff edges occur and mark them with these bold lines on this map. But why might we be so interested in this idea of social frontiers? As Helen mentioned at the start, it's one of the things that we are concerned about, that they might be a source of division. They might be a source that prevents cultures of encounter emerging. And I would, by the way, I would strongly recommend that brilliant documentary that Helen helped to create, called Cultures of Encounter, and we've put a link there in the chat. So we've been working on a number of theoretical hypotheses, drawing on existing literature in segregation and social psychology. And the first one is, the first implication of social frontiers is that they limit the contact between groups. And this limiting of positive contact creates misunderstanding, potentially creates prejudice, potentially creates hostility. Social frontiers limit the potential for contact, because rather than a gradual blending, a mixing of two communities boundaries, what you've got is a very sharp distinction. But we think a really important thing about social frontiers is that when you have that cliff edge in social space, it creates a sense of territoriality. It creates territorial attitudes, and that produces a number of negative things, we think. One is it produces defensive behavior and potentially leading to conflict and crime and violence. It can also produce cultural preservation, a preoccupation with countering the psychological threat by reinforcing the cultural identity of your own group. And that preoccupation then distracts you in your life from pursuing a career, from progressing in education. Instead, you become very much inward looking, focused on reinforcing the cultural identity and preservation of your own group. And it potentially also reinforces neighborhood allegiance. And that's because those who move away from an area that feels threatened, a community that feels threatened, if you move away from that community, if you move away from defending the frontier, then you're seen as a traitor to the cause. The impact of that, and the impact of that cultural preservation, is essentially a reduction in geographical mobility, we're hypothesizing, and that then limits educational and employment opportunities. But we also think that social frontiers can have wider economic impacts. For example, we think that it could fragment the agglomeration economies that occur in cities. These benefits to firms of locating near other firms, those benefits can be fragmented if there is a social frontier. If your firm is located the other side of a social frontier, that fractures your connections with other firms. And it also fractures the pools of labor that you might draw from. For example, you might not feel able to recruit from the other side of the frontier. All of that might reduce productivity. It might reduce the growth potential of local firms, reduce employment and business startup opportunities, and all of those things reduce the opportunity structures, the social mobility of migrants living in those areas. What's the evidence so far? Not a huge amount of work has been done on social frontiers, surprisingly. It's an exciting area for research. This is why we're focusing on it in this project. There has been some research done in Northern Ireland that finds very significant impacts of living close to one of those social frontiers, one of those peace walls. Increases the take-up of antidepressant use, massive increase in the take-up of anti-anxiety drugs, which indicate that social frontiers could have very significant negative mental health impacts. Our own work has been looking at the impact of social frontiers on crime, and we found really quite significantly higher rates of crime here in Sheffield near social frontiers. And that work, similar finding to that work, has been found in American studies. So what the research tells us at the moment is that social frontiers can have negative impacts on mental health and can increase exposure to crime. Both of those things, mental health and crime, we know are huge drivers of social mobility, particularly for those who encounter crime or mental health problems in their formative years. So, in summary then, we're interested in integration, and we believe that social mobility might be a necessary condition for integration. But we're also interested in the extent to which segregation and spatial opportunity structures at a local level can limit social mobility. I should say that our planned research is not just limited to the UK. In fact, it's a 3-country study, and our goal is essentially to compare social frontiers and social mobility in a neoliberal country like the UK compared with more socio-liberal countries like Norway and Sweden. We'll begin our project very soon, looking at detecting social frontiers, applying our algorithms to the whole of the UK and whole of the populated areas of Sweden and Norway. Then we'll go and talk to people. We'll have a qualitative dimension to this. It's a mixed methods approach to understand the lived experience of growing up near social frontiers. And then we'll do some micro-longitudinal analysis looking at the impact on social mobility and the life course. It's quite a big project with some really exciting team of researchers. I won't go through them all just now, but please do visit our website on Life at the Frontier. So in conclusion, I've tried to present a new research agenda that develops measures of integration that consider society as a whole rather than just whether migrants are integrated, and also focuses on the dynamic aspects of integration, particularly social mobility and the spatial drivers of it. I'm now going to hand you over to my Norwegian and Swedish colleagues to say a bit about the context of their own countries. So I'll hand you now over to Liv Osland. Thank you.